Hey there guys, how's it going? Welcome back to my fantasy fight series. So this is another fantasy fight that somebody suggested that I do, and it's another one that I find very intriguing. It's a fight that I think would have been a fascinating one, and that is James Degale against Carl Froch. Now this is a fight that almost did happen back in 2015. You guys will recall James Degale was mandatory for Carl Froch's IBF title. Froch was the IBF champion, and rather than fight Degale, Froch opted to vacate the title, and then several months later, after Degale won the title, Froch decided to retire, so the fight never happened. And that kind of parallels the situation that Carl Froch accused Joe Calzaghe of. You guys remember Joe Calzaghe was unified champion. He consolidated all the belts, and Froch became mandatory for the WBC and called out Calzaghe, when Calzaghe was in the process of moving up to fight Bernard Hopkins. And then because Calzaghe, of course, moved up in weight, vacating the belt, Carl Froch accused him of ducking him and being a coward, this, that, and the other. And again, it's just what happened with James Degale kind of it exposes Carl Froch as a bit of a hypocrite, is all I'm saying. I just thought I'd point that one out, because if there's any doubt whatsoever in the comment section to this video about why this fight didn't ultimately happen, it's very clear to point out that this fight didn't happen because of Carl Froch and Carl Froch alone. So yeah, why didn't this fight happen? Like I said, Carl Froch was retiring, and James Degale was on his way up as a contender. And I don't really want to talk about this fight in regards to how it would have went if they'd fought then, because of course Carl Froch was at the end of his career then, and James Degale was just coming into his prime. So I want to talk about this fight in regards to how it would have happened with both of these guys at their absolute peak. So in my opinion, say Carl Froch from 2011 to 2013, that was Carl Froch at his absolute peak in my personal opinion. And say James Degale after he won the title. So James Degale around about 2015, and it's a shame. James Degale was a fighter who, after he won the world title, he became a complete train wreck. He went completely backwards, in my opinion, and he was never the same again. He never lived the life as a fighter, and it's a shame because, yeah, he could have done a little bit more than he did, in my opinion. And he was a fighter who, like I said, he won the title, and then after winning the title, he just he fell in love with the fame and the hype and the nightlife, and never really lived the life of a fighter. So he never really had the discipline or the motivation that Carl Froch had when he became champion, is the point I'm trying to make. Froch had a lot more longevity, and that's kind of why he bloomed later in his career. Carl Froch hit his peak around about 33, 34, whereas Degale hit his peak in pretty much his late 20s. So I would say let's imagine this fight took place from Carl Froch from around about 2012, 2013, and Degale from around about 2015, when he was at his peak. How would this fight have gone? It's an interesting fight to me, and it's a fight that, in my personal opinion, based on what I know of both of these guys, and I followed both of these guys' career from the very beginning, I definitely think that this fight would have gone the distance. I definitely think it's a 12-round fight, and the reason I say that is because, for one, both of these guys were pretty tough, had very good chins. Both of them were known for their durability and known for being able to tough it out. And neither of them, in my opinion, and I know some people might disagree here, neither one of these guys were massive punchers. I don't think these guys were really elite level power punchers. Neither one of them. Carl Froch was definitely the bigger puncher of the two, but at world level, the vast majority of the time, and even at semi-world level, Carl Froch tended to go the distance in fights. He did have some knockouts, obviously some stoppages, but the vast majority of his higher level opposition tended to go the distance with him. He was never really a one-punch KO kind of guy, give or take just a few fights. So I definitely think that the likelihood is, with both of these guys being quite tough and durable, and neither one of them really being like a David Haye level puncher, I definitely think this probably would have gone the distance. So who do I think would have won this fight? Now, this fight would have been very interesting to me. I think it would have been a very scrappy fight, a very messy fight. Both of these guys were quite dirty and quite rough. Particularly James Degale. James Degale was the type of guy who, on the inside, would rough you up. You know, he would use his elbows and his forearms, and he would stick his head in your face, and he would grab you behind the neck and stuff like that. He was a very, very rough and ungainly type of fighter. Carl Froch, quite similar, but not quite as rough. Froch would basically club you behind the head, and he would throw you to the canvas if he could, and stuff like that. And you know, he was a fighter when he would get frustrated, he would start hitting you with the wrists and hitting you with backhanders and stuff like that. And he was very emotionally erratic at times in the ring, and you know, I think that would have made for a very ugly fight. I definitely think this fight would have been one of them fights where both guys would have been just on the inside. Both guys probably would have got cut. There would have been clashes of heads, and I think it would have been an ungainly and kind of ugly, scrappy mess of a fight. Now, both of these guys did fight some of the same opposition. Obviously, the ones that stand out are, of course, George Groves and Andre Dirrell. Now, when James Degale fought George Groves, that was, of course, his first defeat. That was very early on in his career. He'd only had 9 pro fights, so he was a prospect at that point. Groves was a prospect too, who'd had a couple more fights, who beat him in the amateurs, and it was a very close fight. It was a majority decision, could have gone either way. Groves just sort of nicked the majority of the close rounds and managed to win the fight by a very close majority decision that a lot of people disputed. But me personally, I had no objection to the decision. I thought it was a close fight. I thought Groves just did enough to win, you know, just nicked it. But I wouldn't have argued either way. But even that was a very messy fight. You know, both guys were cut, both guys were swollen quite badly. It was a very ugly and very messy fight. And most of that was down to James Degale and James Degale's roughhouse tactics on the inside. So, yeah, I think that would have been a bit of a clash of styles there with Carl Froch, in my opinion. Now, Carl Froch, of course, fought George Groves, fought him twice. And Groves was a lot more experienced at that point. You know, he was a contender by that point. He was the mandatory challenger for the WBA belt. And he had improved a bit since the DeGale fight. And he dropped Froch quite heavily in the first round, you know, really heavily dropped him with an overhand right and had Froch stumbling all over the place. He went on to pretty much batter Froch for most of the fight. I mean, he beat him for the first 5 rounds, schooled him pretty much. And then Froch started to come on strong because you see Groves in that fight wasted a lot of energy, you know, didn't conserve his energy at all. And Froch, of course, had a lot better stamina and was more proven over 12 rounds. And he started to take over, started to get the better of Groves. And then inexplicably, there was a premature stoppage in the 9th round. Of course, Howard Foster stopped the fight for no reason whatsoever. You know, Froch had Groves on the ropes, but he wasn't really hurting him. He was just sort of outworking him a bit. And Howard Foster stopped the fight. So that was a disgraceful robbery, that fight. We really don't know who would have won that fight if it had, if it hadn't been stopped prematurely. Maybe Froch would have stopped him. Maybe Groves would have won on points. Who knows? But either way, it was a disgraceful robbery. The second fight was probably the best performance from a technical point of view of Froch's career. You know, he managed to hold his own with Groves for the first 7 rounds. It was a very cagey and technical affair, with Froch just getting the better of it behind the jab, and he managed to time Groves and set him up for just a perfect on the button over the hand, you know, over the top right hand, which just flattened Groves. You know, it dropped him on his back, and the fight was over. He couldn't recover. So that was definitely the best performance of Froch's career, just on a technical point of view, in my opinion. And of course, that was where he decided to retire. He decided to retire on that performance. So, judging both of their performances against Groves, it's difficult to really say who was better because both of them fought Groves at a different stage of his career, and styles, of course, make fights. I don't think Froch would do to Groves what he did to. Sorry, I don't think Froch would do to Degale what he did to Groves, for example. I don't think he would be able to beat Groves in the same fashion. Likewise, I don't think Degale had the power to drop Froch early the way that Groves did. So it's an interesting dynamic there, an interesting comparison to make is the point I want to make. The other guy they both fought was, of course, Andre Dirrell. Now, Andre Dirrell fought Froch back in 2009, back in October 2009 in the Super 6. It was the first stage of the Super 6. It was one of the most disgraceful robberies I think I've ever seen. Andre Durrell beat Carl Froch, and he beat Carl Froch pretty easily and pretty handily. It was actually a very one-sided fight. If you don't believe me, go and watch that fight. It was a very easy and one-sided fight, and Froch got badly exposed and schooled in that fight. And yeah, it was a hometown decision. I mean, it was Froch spent the whole fight fouling. I mean, hitting Durrell behind the head, hitting him on the break, hitting him with forearms, throwing him to the canvas, getting him in headlocks, just fouling the whole fight. And yet Durrell had a point deducted, and and yeah, it was a split decision in Nottingham, in Froch's hometown. It was a disgraceful decision. Andrew Durrell was horribly robbed in that fight. Um, Durrell, of course, years later went on to fight James Degale. That was for the IBF World Title. Degale dropped Groves twice in the second round. He dropped Durrell twice in the second round and outboxed him in the early part of the fight. However, later in that fight, Degale completely ran out of gas, and Durrell started to whip his ass and started to school him in the later rounds. But it was too little, too late. I think the knockdowns, as well as the accumulation of rounds that Degale had picked up in the early rounds of that fight, was just too much for Degale to catch up and Durrell to catch up. And although Durrell had a lot of success in the latter part of the fight, the early part of the fight was just he'd given away too many rounds, and Degale won the fight pretty clearly. I think Durrell was pretty shot at that point. That's one thing I need to point out, is Durrell wasn't the same fighter when he fought Degale as what he was when he fought Froch. I think he was closer to his prime when he fought Froch. He was undefeated and much more athletic, had more ambition, had better stamina, he was in better shape. He wasn't dealing with injuries and stuff like that. When he fought Degale, he was in and out of retirement, and wasn't really in the best of shape. So I think that Degale's victory was, although he was much better against Durrell, had a much better performance, did a much better job. I have to take into consideration that Degale was at his prime versus a past his prime Andre Durrell, whereas Froch fought probably a prime Durrell at when they were both close to their prime. So that's an interesting comparison to make there. Who do I think would have won this fight? I think the difference in this fight would have been stamina. Now, I mentioned earlier that James Degale had stamina issues. He was a fighter who would fall apart midway through fights and would need to get a second wind. Carl Froch had tremendous stamina. That's one thing I will say about him. I never saw him gas in a fight. The only time I've seen him come close to gassing in a fight was where he fought Mikhail Kessler the first time, because Mikhail Kessler hit him with some absolutely solid body shots in the first half of that fight. He was piecing Froch up with straight right hands to the body, and I think Froch was kind of shocked by that. He wasn't expecting that kind of aggressive body attack from Kessler. But other than that fight, I've never seen Froch look fatigued in a fight, never seen him look tired in a fight. He had tremendous stamina, tremendous work rate, and Degale on the inside may have been better defensively. I don't think Degale had great defense, but he was more defensively skilled than Froch. He was more technically gifted than Froch. But I think that Froch's superior physical strength, his superior power, his superior stamina, and his superior work rate would have gotten the better of James Degale. And I think Carl Froch would have won this fight. I think Carl Froch would have won this fight by a close, unanimous decision. I think maybe Degale would have been ahead in the early part of the fight, but I don't think he has the power to keep Froch off him. I don't think he has the power to drop Froch. And I think that Froch, in my personal opinion, would just edge this one out. I think he would edge this fight out on points. So I would go with Carl Froch by a very close, unanimous decision. Maybe he would have to come from behind to win that decision. I think that it would all depend on whether or not James Degale was able to make enough of an impression in the early part of the fight to bank the rounds. But I think Froch would win this fight. I think he would win this fight on points. If this fight were to have happened when it was going to happen, when Froch was at the end of his career, maybe then I would give Degale a slightly better chance. I would still favour Froch, but I would give Degale a slightly better chance at that point of his career. But I think both of them at their absolute prime, I go with Froch